The war had ended, but the moral reckoning had only begun. As nations measured their triumphs in cities liberated and territories reclaimed, the United States quietly held another kind of victory, one that could not be displayed in parades or carved into stone. It was a triumph of principle, born not from conquest, but from conduct. America's image in the ruins of war in the immediate aftermath of World War II, the United States emerged as more than a military power. It became a moral reference point. While the Soviet Union expanded its borders through fear and the British Empire struggled to retain its colonies, America's strength appeared rooted in something different. Credibility. The humane treatment of German prisoners became one of the most powerful proofs of that credibility. When Allied forces occupied Germany, they encountered not only physical devastation, but also moral exhaustion. The German people were wary, humiliated, and traumatized. Yet the testimonies of returning POWs, men who had eaten, studied, and worked in America, softened the bitterness. A study by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946, found that these first-hand accounts did more to reduce hostility toward occupation forces than any official propaganda. In other words, America's kindness in captivity had achieved what even victory could not. Trust across devastated towns. Men who once followed Hitler began speaking of fairness, order, and law, values they had witnessed, not read about. Their stories humanized the conqueror and helped Germany accept democratic re-education without open rebellion. From camps to policy, the Cold War lessons inside the Pentagon. The lessons of the POW camps were not forgotten. The same War Department officers who had managed those compounds were now shaping post-war policy. Their conclusion was unanimous. Moral strength had strategic value. The Geneva Convention, once treated as a diplomatic obligation, was now viewed as a weapon of influence. American policymakers realized that humane treatment of prisoners, and by extension, humane governance of occupied territories, created durable legitimacy in the eyes of both enemies and allies. This philosophy quietly informed the early years of the Cold War. When the United States organized the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe, it applied the same logic used in the POW camps. Feed your former enemy, educate them, and they will never return to extremism. The plan's architects, men like George C. Marshall and Dean Acheson, understood that generosity, backed by strength, could stabilize nations faster than coercion. In a sense, the lessons learned at Camp Clinton echoed through the corridors of Washington. What began with roast beef and apple pie evolved into a blueprint for peace through prosperity. The German perspective. Memory and gratitude for. The German officers who lived through captivity in the United States, those years remained etched in memory. In their post-war writings, they often contrasted American restraint with the chaos they returned to in Europe. General Hasso von Manteuffel, who had fought in the Ardennes, wrote in 1952, "They treated us with a discipline that shamed us. I learned that law without hate is the truest form of power." Others echoed similar sentiments. Their testimonies appeared in memoirs, academic works, and public speeches throughout West Germany's Reconstruction. Even those who had not renounced nationalism admitted that the Americans' consistency, their refusal to descend into vengeance, had forced them to reconsider what strength truly meant. As West Germany's democracy matured, that sense of respect became mutual. The same officers once imprisoned under American watch would later host their former captors as allies within NATO. What had begun as captivity ended as cooperation. The global reputation internationally, America's treatment of German POWs became a moral benchmark. When the Geneva Convention was revised in 1949, several clauses were directly influenced by U.S. practices, notably equal rations, cultural rights, and access to education for prisoners. Humanitarian organizations, including the International Committee of the Red Cross, publicly praised the U.S. record, calling it a model of adherence to civilized warfare. At a time when much of Europe still reeled from atrocities, this distinction mattered. It allowed the United States to project moral authority in a world now divided between democracy and totalitarianism. For countries recovering from occupation, France, the Netherlands, Norway, it reaffirmed the belief that power could be ethical. The unspoken contrast, the deeper legacy, lay in contrast. Where Soviet labor camps turned hatred into inheritance, American POW camps turned enmity into reflection. One created silence through fear. The other created silence through respect. When Cold War lines hardened, those differences mattered. German families who had heard of kindness in America were far less susceptible to Soviet propaganda. By the early 1950s, as Washington sought allies in Western Europe, that moral credibility paid its greatest dividend. A Germany willing to trust the same flag that had once flown over its prison compounds. The final accounting by 1956, most of the POW camps in the United States had vanished, their wooden barracks dismantled or absorbed into farmlands. Yet, historians would later note that their legacy endured, not as physical sites, but as moral precedents. America's triumph lay not in the prisoners it held, but in what it refused to become while holding them. The restraint shown at Camp Clinton, Camp Swift, and hundreds of others across the country had proven something rare in human history. That mercy, applied consistently, could change nations more deeply than might. A simple truth had emerged from the wreckage of global war: that feeding one's enemy was sometimes the most powerful victory of all. War is often remembered for its destruction, for the thunder of guns, the maps redrawn, the monuments built upon loss. Yet sometimes, history's most enduring power lies in the moments when humanity refuses to disappear, even amid conquest. The story of the German Field Marshals at Camp Clinton is one such moment. No armies clashed there, no flags were taken, no blood spilled, and yet, in that quiet Mississippi dining hall, something profound occurred. A civilization revealed its strength not through domination, but through dignity. What began as an act of compliance with the Geneva Convention became a living demonstration of the values it represented. Every tray of food, every respectful salute, every consistent rule applied without hatred. These were the bricks from which moral authority was built. The United States proved that mercy, applied with discipline, could do what fear never could: reshape the conscience of its enemies. For the German officers, that meal marked more than surrender. It was an awakening. They had lived their lives in a system that equated ruthlessness with power. But in captivity, they discovered a new kind of command, one grounded in restraint, fairness, and quiet confidence. And that realization, multiplied across thousands of men, helped plant the seeds of a democratic Germany. For America, it was an affirmation that ideals are only as strong as their application. To feed one's enemy with decency was to declare in action that civilization had survived the war. When those men returned home, they carried with them not humiliation, but memory. A memory of a nation that conquered without cruelty. That memory outlasted the war, shaping alliances, doctrines, and the moral fabric of a divided century. In the end, the most powerful victories of World War II were not won in the skies over Europe or the beaches of the Pacific, but in the quiet places where humanity endured, in a meal shared across barbed wire, in the choice to treat the defeated as human, because history will always remember the destruction of nations. But it is decency, quietly upheld, that rebuilds them. The moment in that Mississippi dining hall did not fade into obscurity. It spread, carried quietly through letters, reports, and rumors that flowed along the network of POW camps scattered across the American heartland. From Camp Clinton to Camp Swift, Camp Shelby, Camp Crossville, and even up to Camp Shanks in New York, the story traveled like a parable whispered between guards and prisoners alike. The field marshal said it tastes better than our banquets. What began as a single remark became a symbol, one that redefined how both sides saw themselves. The moral chain reaction at Camp Swift, Texas. Officers began requesting recipes from the American cooks, asking to learn how to prepare American-style stews. At Camp Shelby, German doctors expressed admiration for the camp's medical organization, calling it more disciplined than the Reich's field hospitals. It wasn't flattery. It was recalibration, the slow realization that the efficiency they had once claimed as purely German virtue could exist elsewhere, grounded not in fear, but in fairness. Reports from the Office of the Provost Marshal General recorded these changes meticulously. Intelligence officers noticed a new tone in interrogations. Less resistance, more curiosity. Some high-ranking prisoners began to speak of the United States not as an enemy, but as an unimaginably organized society. One officer wrote, almost in confession, "We thought we fought barbarians. Instead, we found a civilization." For U.S. intelligence, this evolution was gold. It meant that moral persuasion had succeeded where propaganda might have failed. Every small act of decency became an instrument of influence, shaping not just individual captives, but the entire image of America in the minds of Germany's future leaders. The intelligence opportunity in late 1944, the U.S. military began to consolidate its psychological and intelligence efforts around what it had learned from these camps. Officers from the Special Projects Division traveled from state to state, interviewing camp administrators about their methods. Their conclusion was simple and revolutionary. Humanitarian treatment was not weakness. It was a tool of strategic power. This idea soon merged into operations that would later define the early Cold War. When Allied intelligence sought to identify which captured German officers could contribute to post-war reconstruction, they didn't just examine technical skill. They looked for those who had shown moral adaptability. Many of those men came from the U.S. POW camps. They were the ones who had debated in English, who had read the Constitution, who had stood silently when the American flag was raised in the morning. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, dozens of these officers were quietly interviewed by Allied political divisions. Some were later integrated into denazification projects. Others advised on rebuilding the German army that would become the Bundeswehr in 1955. A few, like General Reinhard Gehlen, would go on to lead intelligence services under Western supervision, forming the backbone of NATO's early intelligence network. None of this was accidental. It was the culmination of the same psychological current that began in those POW camps. The belief that an enemy could be re-educated not through coercion, but through contrast. The banquet as metaphor, the banquet remark, was more than an anecdote. Within the U.S. Army's moral philosophy, it became a metaphor, a shorthand for winning without cruelty. During the post-war years, U.S. military academies and ethics programs referenced the POW experience as proof that law and discipline could coexist with compassion. In internal lectures, commanders cited the Geneva Convention not merely as an obligation, but as a weapon of legitimacy. A 1946 War Department memo summed it up. Where the Axis ruled by fear, we governed by law. Where they fed with ration, we fed with honor. That is why they will remember. Even American newspapers, in subdued tones, began to publish pieces on the gentle captivity of German prisoners. Some citizens objected. Why feed the enemy so well? But the military remained steadfast. The United States was shaping not only how Germany would remember the war, but how the world would measure civilization itself. The German officers understood this too. One former general, returning to Germany in 1946, told a journalist, We lost the war the moment we sat down at that table. He did not mean the battlefield. He meant the banquet, the confrontation with a morality stronger than his ideology. The cultural echo in Germany, when repatriation began, many former POWs brought their experiences back to a devastated homeland. They spoke to families, students, and even church congregations about the discipline, fairness, and humanity they had witnessed. These accounts played a quiet but vital role in reshaping post-war German consciousness. They contrasted sharply with stories from those who had suffered in Soviet camps, tales of starvation, beatings, and endless labor. The two narratives, one of vengeance, one of principle, helped tilt Germany's moral compass toward the West. Historians later observed that America's humane treatment of POWs became one of the most effective tools of ideological alignment in post-war Europe. It wasn't part of any Marshall Plan or official doctrine. It was the residue of simple decency turned into memory. A quiet victory. In a war measured by destruction. Millions dead, cities leveled, entire nations erased. This moral victory seemed small, almost invisible. Yet its consequences were immense. The humane POW policy, embodied in that simple phrase, "It tastes better than our banquets," became an unspoken foundation of post-war reconciliation. It helped Germany accept defeat without humiliation, allowing a space for dignity to survive amid ruin. The same field marshals who had surrendered with bitterness would later write memoirs acknowledging that America's fairness had disarmed them more completely than any battlefield defeat. And when the Cold War dawned, those memories would help secure an alliance built not just on strategy, but on trust. From the perspective of history, the banquet at Camp Clinton was not a meal, it was an inflection point, a moment when the victors proved that moral strength could wield more lasting influence than military power. From that dining hall, the echoes traveled through time into diplomacy, reconstruction, and even the conscience of a defeated generation. The guns fell silent on May 8, 1945. Germany was in ruins, its cities blackened, its railways twisted, its people starving. But across the ocean, behind the barbed wire fences of America, tens of thousands of German prisoners were still waking to morning roll call and hot coffee. For them, the war had ended months earlier, in spirit, if not in law. The shock of defeat had already given way to something subtler, a mixture of gratitude, confusion, and reflection. They had come to the United States as enemies. They would leave as witnesses to its moral victory. The quiet process of repatriation. In the summer of 1945, the War Department began one of the largest logistical undertakings of the post-war period. The repatriation of German POWs. More than 370,000 men had to be processed, medically cleared, and shipped across the Atlantic, a task that took nearly 3 years. At Camp Clinton, the same officers who had once dined on banquet food gathered in orderly formations. Each was issued a discharge certificate, a ration pack, and a few dollars in U.S. military scrip. They boarded trains to New York, where troop ships waited to return them to a homeland they no longer recognized. Many wrote farewell letters to the American guards and cooks. Some enclosed photographs or small tokens. A patch, a carved trinket, a hand-drawn sketch of the camp. One note, found years later in the National Archives, read, "I will remember that I was treated as a man, not a number. It will help me rebuild what is left of my country." By 1946, most enlisted men were already gone, sent home through Allied-controlled ports in France and England. The officers, especially those of higher rank, remained longer, both for interrogation and for debriefing on strategic matters. Field marshals, generals, and staff officers were questioned not under duress, but under coffee and conversation. Their knowledge was valuable, their cooperation freely given. U.S. assessments of the POW program as the repatriations progressed The U.S. Army's Historical Division began compiling comprehensive reports on the POW system. Their findings were striking. Despite housing hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers, the United States had recorded extraordinarily few incidents of violence or unrest. Escapes were rare, mutinies non-existent. The majority of prisoners worked diligently in agriculture and public works, producing millions of man-hours of labor that helped sustain the wartime economy. Farmers across the Midwest and South often remarked that the Germans were the best workers we ever had. When asked why, one American officer gave a simple answer. "We treated them right, and they acted right." The War Department's report, titled German Prisoners of War in the United States, 1945, went further. Discipline was maintained without cruelty. Respect was achieved without fear. The American model of conduct stands as evidence that humane policy yields practical security. It was, in bureaucratic prose, an acknowledgement of moral triumph. The seeds of Reconstruction, when those officers stepped off the ships into the wreckage of post-war Germany, they carried more than personal memories. They carried impressions that would influence an entire generation. Many became administrators, teachers, or advisors during the Allied occupation. Some were quietly approached by U.S. or British officials to assist in rebuilding the civil infrastructure. They were chosen PR. One general reportedly said, "They salute me because the rules demand it, not because they fear me." That is the difference. In Nazi Germany, respect was enforced through fear. In America, it appeared to flow from conviction. The effect was unsettling. Officers who once demanded obedience began volunteering for tasks, even assisting in English-language broadcasts meant for other POWs. Conversations shifted from bitterness to introspection. Some prisoners began to question the values of the system they had served. The Americans did not push ideology directly. They let contrast do the teaching, the daily experience of equality, of guards eating the same food as prisoners, of rules applying universally, chipped away at the psychology of superiority. A U.S. intelligence memo dated February 1945 noted, "German officers now express more fear of returning to a Nazi Germany than of remaining in captivity. Their confidence in the Reich's destiny is fading." This slow erosion of belief was precisely what Washington hoped for. Not to humiliate the enemy, but to prepare the ground for a future where these same men might help rebuild, rather than resist, a democratic Germany. The approach worked. After the war, many of these officers would become influential figures in the Bundeswehr, the new West German army founded in the 1950s. They brought with them a strange memory that their conquerors had treated them better than their own regime ever did. The historical contrast from defeat to rebirth history would remember World War II for its extremes of cruelty. Concentration camps, scorched earth battles, cities reduced to ashes. Yet amid that darkness, the treatment of German POWs in the United States stands as one of the few humanitarian paradoxes of the era. Where others sought vengeance, America sought principle. Where hatred was easy, restraint prevailed. This distinction did not go unnoticed in post-war Europe. The humane handling of POWs became a cornerstone of America's image in occupied Germany. Returning officers spoke of fair treatment, generous food, and unexpected respect. Their testimonies contradicted Nazi propaganda and softened the population's resistance to Allied reconstruction efforts. In the 1946 Nuremberg trials, even as justice was administered to war criminals, many former prisoners privately acknowledged that the same nation judging them had shown them mercy in captivity. It was a silent but enduring form of legitimacy. Moral credibility built through action, not rhetoric. The contrast also extended to domestic perception. For the American public, newsreels occasionally showed smiling POWs harvesting crops or building fences under the sun. While some citizens criticized this leniency, military leadership defended it fiercely. "We are not fighting to become what we despise," one officer declared to reporters. By adhering to its principles even under provocation, the United States demonstrated that power could be just, that law could exist even in war. This lesson would echo through later conflicts, from Korea to Vietnam, as policymakers debated the balance between humanity and security. In these camps, through food, conversation, and small acts of civility, the Americans had accomplished something extraordinary. They had defeated the ideology of superiority without firing a shot. And yet, the story was far from over. The turning point, the moment that encapsulated this entire moral transformation, would occur in one unassuming dining hall in Mississippi, when a table of defeated field marshals found themselves humbled not by their captors' might, but by their mercy. Camp Clinton, Mississippi, autumn 1944. The war in Europe was entering its final convulsions. Paris had been liberated. The Allies were pushing through France, and in the Pacific, island after island was falling to relentless American assaults. Yet here, thousands of miles from the thunder of artillery, another kind of battle was being won, not with bombs or tanks, but with civility and bread. Inside the mess hall of Compound A, the air was filled with the clatter of trays and the low hum of conversation. The building smelled faintly of soap and roasted meat. Through screened windows, the Mississippi sun poured in golden streaks, catching the faint outlines of barbed wire beyond. At one long wooden table sat 6 German generals and 2 field marshals, men who, only a year earlier, had commanded divisions across Africa and Europe. Their uniforms were clean, their posture still proud, though their war was over. The day's menu was simple but rich. Roast beef with gravy, mashed potatoes, green beans, white bread, coffee, and apple pie. The same meal, in the same portions, was being served simultaneously to the American guards and officers on the other side of camp. That parity, that equality, was by design. A young Army cook, no older than 20, moved between tables with quiet diligence. He served each plate with a firm hand and a short nod. No mockery, no deference, just procedure. The Germans watched him with the same detached curiosity they once reserved for enemy soldiers. But when the first forkfuls were taken, the atmosphere shifted. Silence fell. One of the generals, once a corps commander in Tunisia, looked up from his plate, visibly unsettled. He exchanged a glance with the man beside him, a field marshal, his silver collar tabs dulled but unmistakable. The older man hesitated, then cut another slice of beef, chewed thoughtfully, and nodded with slow approval. "It is well seasoned," he murmured in German. "Tender. Remarkably tender." A few of the others chuckled quietly, not mockery, but disbelief. Another added, "The coffee. Even in Paris, we had none this good." The young cook overheard, but said nothing. He kept serving, moving down the row, while the German officers continued to eat, their conversation growing lighter, more human. The tension in their shoulders eased. The guards, too, noticed. And then, as the moment settled into calm, the senior field marshal, his voice graveled by age and dust, set down his fork, leaned slightly forward, and said it aloud for all to hear. "It tastes better than our banquets." The words came not as compliment, but as confession. For the Americans standing nearby, it was a sentence that would be remembered for years. To them, it meant vindication, proof that victory could exist in small gestures. To the Germans, it was something else entirely. The recognition that their captors had defeated them not only in battle, but in morality. The mess hall remained quiet for a long moment after that remark. No one laughed, no one responded. There was only the sound of spoons on tin trays and the slow rhythm of chewing. Later that evening, one of the guards wrote in his journal, "They dined like officers, not prisoners. They thanked us, some quietly, some with their eyes. I think they began to see that decency is stronger than fear. That dinner became legend among both prisoners and guards. Word spread across the compound. The field marshal said it tastes better than their banquets. It was retold in letters home, in military reports, and later in oral histories collected by the War Department. What mattered was not the food itself, but what it represented. The men who had once toasted Hitler in marble halls now found themselves grateful for a meal served by the army that had crushed them. In that quiet hall, the grand illusion of superiority, the myth of the master race, collapsed beneath the weight of mashed potatoes and mercy. Behind the scenes, American intelligence officers took note. They reported that morale among captured officers had shifted dramatically. Some began cooperating during interviews. Others volunteered information on logistical methods, orders, and even technical details of German equipment. They did not do it out of fear, but from an emerging belief that America might use their knowledge justly, not vindictively. In Washington, the Office of the Provost Marshal General summarized it in one chillingly simple sentence: "Good food has achieved what interrogation could not." To the War Department, the strategy had succeeded beyond expectation. The banquet effect, as it was later called in internal memos, demonstrated the power of humane dominance, a victory of character over coercion. But for the German officers themselves, the realization was personal and painful. In the days that followed, some began to request meetings with chaplains. Others spent hours walking the perimeter, silent and thoughtful. A few wrote letters home that the censors preserved. One read, "I am being treated with respect by those who had every reason to hate me. If Germany survives, it must learn from this." Another wrote simply, "We have met a better enemy than we ever were." These quiet revelations marked the psychological turning point of the POW experience in the United States. What began as captivity became moral confrontation, the recognition that the enemy's ethics were stronger than their own ideology. And as the autumn of 1944 gave way to winter, the same field marshals who had once presided over parades in Berlin now stood at attention when the U.S. flag was raised for morning roll call, not out of compulsion, but from something deeper: acknowledgement. The meal at Camp Clinton would echo long after the war ended. It was retold in memoirs, cited in Senate hearings, and eventually studied by military historians as an example of psychological warfare through compassion. It proved that even in the darkest chapter of modern history, civilization could assert itself through a simple act: a meal shared in fairness, under a roof built by the victors, yet illuminated by humanity. The Special Projects Division, headquartered at Fort Kearny, Rhode Island, monitored these shifts closely. Its staff, linguists, psychologists, professors, developed a quiet system of classification: ardent Nazis, passive followers, doubtfuls, and potential Democrats. Each was handled differently. Hardliners were isolated, while moderates were given more freedom to interact and think. By 1944, entire groups of prisoners were participating in what the Americans called intellectual rehabilitation. Newspapers written by POWs circulated within camps, supervised by U.S. intelligence officers. Some even printed anti-Nazi editorials, marking the slow but visible breakdown of ideological conditioning. Not all approved. Within Germany, the Nazi regime denounced the United States for its soft decadence, claiming the Americans were poisoning their officers with comfort and lies. But the truth was subtler and more powerful. A captured general once told his interrogator, "If the Reich falls, it will not be the bombs that destroyed it. It will be this kindness that makes us ashamed." By the end of 1944, more than 370,000 German POWs were held in the United States. They harvested cotton in Texas, built roads in Kansas, and worked the fields in the Midwest. They were paid small wages, learned English, and, most importantly, were treated as men rather than monsters. For many, it was their first sustained encounter with democracy in practice. The realization was deeply disorienting. The enemy was not the barbarian they had been told to hate. It was within this quiet confrontation of conscience that moments like the banquet remark emerged, gestures so small yet symbolically immense. The war had not yet ended, but within those barbed wire perimeters, a different kind of victory was already being won. The human angle. Captivity without chains for the German officers held in America. The first and greatest shock was not defeat. It was dignity. Most had braced themselves for humiliation. The propaganda they had consumed for years told them that Americans were decadent, crude, and racially inferior. Instead, they were met with calm professionalism, even courtesy. Inside Camp Clinton, guards greeted them with "Sir." American officers saluted them according to rank. Meals were served with efficiency, not mockery. When one general requested that his uniform be repaired, the camp tailor, a private from Kansas, stitched it neatly and handed it back with a respectful nod. These gestures were not trivial. They carried weight. For men who had lived in a rigid hierarchy obsessed with honor and status, this unexpected civility from a democracy unsettled them more deeply than any interrogation could. Many prisoners wrote home about it in letters screened by censors, but preserved in archives today. One colonel described it this way: "They defeat us in battle, yet they do not hate us. It is a strange thing to be treated as a human being after such defeat." That line echoed a truth no bomb could deliver, that humanity itself was a weapon. The Americans understood the psychological effect of fairness. Starvation and cruelty hardened men. Respect softened them. Inside those camps, some of Germany's most loyal officers began to feel the moral ground shifting beneath their feet. Even decades later, historians studying POW memoirs found consistent descriptions of relief, confusion, and eventual admiration. One of the most striking outcomes was that not a single high-ranking German prisoner ever escaped from the American officer camps. Not because they couldn't, but because, as one guard later said, they didn't want to leave. The tactical angle. Morality as military strategy. The American approach was not naive idealism. It was strategic psychology, refined through both moral conviction and military calculation. When the United States joined the war in 1941, it faced not only the task of defeating Axis armies but also the ideological systems that sustained them. Nazi Germany's propaganda machine thrived on depicting Americans as savages, lawless, materialistic, and racially impure. Every act of American fairness toward German prisoners became a counter-message to that narrative. The War Department's Psychological Warfare Branch recognized that POWs were valuable beyond intelligence. Each captive general was a potential messenger, each camp a theater of influence. If the Americans could plant seeds of respect, disillusionment, or even quiet admiration, those officers would carry it home to the very people who might shape Germany's future after the war. This idea crystallized in 1943 under the direction of Major General Allen W. Gullion, Provost Marshal General of the U.S. Army. He instructed camp commanders to uphold the Geneva Convention not merely as law, but as a demonstration of American character. He believed, correctly, that discipline and moral consistency were instruments of power. Treating POWs well also had a pragmatic military benefit. Reports from Europe confirmed that German units fought more fiercely against Soviets than against Western allies. Part of that difference stemmed from what German soldiers expected upon capture. They feared annihilation in the East, but survival in the West. American humane treatment indirectly encouraged surrender, reducing Allied casualties and accelerating the war's end. In other words, kindness saved lives on both sides. The moral angle, the enemy as a mirror. The banquet remark that would later become famous was not about food alone. It was a moment of moral revelation. When the field marshal took that bite of roast beef and declared, "It tastes better than our banquets," he was acknowledging something far larger, the defeat of arrogance. The Third Reich had built its myth on supremacy: racial, cultural, moral. To its followers, the German way was the pinnacle of civilization. Yet here they were, tasting generosity from a democracy their Führer had called corrupt. In a sense, the dining hall at Camp Clinton became a courtroom of conscience. The verdict was quiet but final. The Reich's moral claims collapsed under the weight of a simple meal served without hatred. This was America's moral offensive. Subtle, disciplined, and profoundly human. It proved that strength did not require cruelty, and victory did not demand revenge. Even some U.S. guards felt conflicted. Many had lost friends in Africa or Europe, yet the Army required them to treat these same men with decency. For them, too, it was a moral education. One sergeant later wrote in his diary, "I came here to guard Nazis. I leave having met men, some proud, some broken, but all human." Maybe that's the difference between us and them. This approach would echo into post-war Europe. By refusing to dehumanize its captives, America not only upheld its ideals, it preserved the moral foundation upon which the Marshall Plan and the rebirth of democratic Germany would later rest. The human, tactical and moral dimensions intertwined to form one of the most remarkable contrasts of the Second World War, a democracy that conquered without cruelty. But the story deepens further. Beyond the officers' initial shock, beyond the moral revelation of their first meal. What followed inside those camps would transform many of these men from enemies into reluctant students of democracy itself. The cultural angle. German discipline meets American democracy for men raised in the strict codes of Prussian order. Life in an American POW camp was a paradox, disciplined yet free in ways they had never known. Inside Camp Clinton and others like it, the Germans quickly began organizing themselves. Within weeks, they had elected internal officers, set up classrooms, and even formed orchestras. They played Bach and Beethoven in wooden halls that smelled of coffee and sawdust. The Americans did not suppress these activities. They encouraged them. To the U.S. command, these acts were not threats. They were proof that respect could yield order without oppression. It was a deliberate demonstration. Democracy did not mean chaos. The Germans were astonished by the camp library. Thousands of books, many donated by American universities, filled the shelves. English literature, philosophy, engineering manuals. The officers were allowed to study, debate, and even request translations. Some began reading Thomas Paine, Lincoln's speeches, and the U.S. Constitution. Slowly, cultural curiosity replaced suspicion. German teachers held English classes for their peers. U.S. chaplains led voluntary sermons on forgiveness and freedom. One colonel, a school teacher before the war, began teaching mathematics to enlisted prisoners, remarking that he'd never had so eager a class. Camp newspapers soon followed, written in German, censored lightly by U.S. officials. At first, they contained reports on Red Cross shipments or camp events. But by late 1944, they began including essays that questioned the Reich's direction, subtle criticisms of Hitler's leadership, and reflections on democracy. The transformation was quiet, but profound. What had begun as a system of control was turning into an experiment in moral education, a classroom built from barbed wire and decency. The psychological angle, breaking the myth of superiority. Psychologists, working under the Special Projects Division, observed the process carefully. They noted a recurring pattern: initial defiance, gradual dissonance, then reluctant admiration. Captured generals, especially those of the old Prussian school, had believed themselves the intellectual elite of Europe. They saw Americans as materialists, men of machines, not of spirit. But in captivity, the myth eroded. The guards were often polite, the cooks professional, the doctors competent. There was no cruelty, only procedure. The Americans' very indifference to rank confused them. The morning mist drifts low over a stretch of barbed wire, curling around wooden guard towers that rise from the flat southern soil. Beyond the fences, German field marshals and generals, once accustomed to marble halls and grand banquets, stand silently in line, boots scuffing the gravel. Their uniforms are neatly pressed, medals dulled by captivity, but still worn with pride. Inside the mess hall, sunlight slants through narrow windows, falling across rows of metal trays filled with food that no prisoner expects. Roast beef, buttered potatoes, fresh bread still steaming, and a slice of apple pie, warm, fragrant, and unmistakably American. The officers exchange uncertain glances. A young U.S. sergeant gestures respectfully. "Gentlemen, your lunch." Forks scrape softly against tin as the first bites are taken. Then a pause. The men glance at one another, disbelief softening rigid faces. Finally, one of them, his rank stars still gleaming faintly, sets down his fork and murmurs in quiet astonishment, "It tastes better than our banquets." The words hang in the air, heavier than the silence that follows. The story begins long before that quiet moment in Mississippi. In the spring of 1943, across the burning sands of North Africa, the war that Hitler once promised would never reach German soil was already turning against him. The Afrika Korps, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, was collapsing under the combined pressure of British, American, and Free French forces. Supply lines had been strangled by Allied naval superiority. Luftwaffe air cover had thinned to almost nothing, and Rommel's seasoned troops, hungry, exhausted, and surrounded, were running out of everything except discipline. By May 1943, the Axis position in Tunisia was untenable. Over 250,000 German and Italian soldiers surrendered in one of the largest capitulations of the entire war, a second Stalingrad, but on foreign soil. Among them were some of Germany's most decorated officers, including General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, the commander of Army Group Africa, and several high-ranking staff officers who had once shared strategy tables with Field Marshal Erwin Rommel himself. For the Americans, this influx of prisoners posed a logistical and moral question. How do you handle an enemy that only months ago sought your destruction? President Franklin D. Roosevelt, General George C. Marshall, and the War Department decided on a path guided not by vengeance, but by law. The United States would adhere strictly to the 1929 Geneva Convention on the Treatment of Prisoners of War, a document Germany itself had signed. Though not always honored, the decision was not merely moral. It was practical, strategic, and profoundly psychological. In the months that followed, German POWs began arriving in waves on American soil. They came aboard converted troop ships, escorted by destroyers across the Atlantic. Many expected to be paraded through hostile cities or thrown into grim camps. Instead, they found something entirely different. By mid-1943, the U.S. Army had established a network of over 500 POW camps across the country, stretching from the deserts of Arizona to the forests of Wisconsin. Among them, Camp Clinton in Mississippi, Camp Shelby, Camp Swift in Texas, and Camp Tonkawa in Oklahoma stood out as the main facilities for German officers and high-ranking personnel. Camp Clinton, in particular, was no ordinary prison. Built on 400 acres of fenced farmland, it was designed more like a self-contained town than a camp. Inside its wooden barracks, German field marshals, generals, and colonels found beds with clean sheets, showers with running water, and kitchens stocked with meat, milk, and flour. They were permitted to write letters home, to receive Red Cross parcels, and even to organize lectures and orchestra performances. What shocked them most was not the comfort, but the respect. American guards saluted German officers according to rank, as required by the convention. Meals were served punctually. Medical care was identical to that of U.S. troops stationed nearby. There were rules, yes, but they were clear and consistent. Nothing like the arbitrary brutality some had heard about in Soviet or Balkan captivity. At first, suspicion ruled the air. The captured officers suspected propaganda. Some thought the food and cleanliness were temporary illusions staged for reporters. But days turned into weeks, and the humane treatment continued. The Germans realized this was not theater. It was policy. Behind this discipline lay a deeper motive. The United States, unlike its Axis counterparts, viewed POW treatment as an extension of psychological warfare. Good treatment would undermine Nazi propaganda, sow doubt in loyalists, and demonstrate to the world the moral distinction between totalitarianism and democracy. In Washington, Lieutenant Colonel Edward Davison, a former professor of English, had been put in charge of the Special Projects Division, a secret initiative responsible for the re-education of German POWs. His approach was subtle. No forced indoctrination, no punishment. Instead, the Americans let comfort, fairness, and small glimpses of freedom do the work. A film screening here, a book discussion there, carefully chosen materials that exposed prisoners to democratic values, war crimes evidence, and the idea that humanity could exist even between enemies. By late 1943, many German officers at Camp Clinton began to talk openly about the contradictions of the Reich. Some privately admitted that they were being treated better as captives of America than as soldiers under Berlin's command. One U.S. report from the Office of the Provost Marshal General noted, high-ranking German prisoners were surprised by the civility of their treatment. One officer, accustomed to lavish service, commented that our food tastes better than our banquets. Another confessed disbelief that America would feed even its enemies so well. It was not simply about food. It was a moral contrast made tangible through small acts. Coffee served warm, guards who offered cigarettes instead of insults, and cooks who took pride in preparing meals for men who, only months earlier, had fired upon them. This was how the war was being won in silence, through the quiet power of example. While German officers in America were adjusting to life behind fences lined with magnolias and pine, the fate of their compatriots elsewhere could not have been more different. In the East, the Soviet Union, ravaged, brutalized, and unbound by the Geneva Convention, showed no mercy. Captured German troops from Stalingrad to Kursk were marched eastward in freezing columns. Of the 90,000 taken prisoner at Stalingrad, fewer than 6,000 ever returned. They starved, froze, and labored to death in camps stretching from the Urals to Siberia. Food was scarce, disease rampant, and executions common. The Soviets viewed it as justice, not cruelty. In contrast, British POW camps were firm but humane. The British had longer experience managing prisoners and generally adhered to the Geneva Code, though rations were lean due to wartime shortages. Germany's officers held in Britain at Trent Park, however, faced a different kind of captivity, one of surveillance. The British had bugged the mansion's walls, secretly recording conversations among captured generals like Gerd von Rundstedt, Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma, and Ulrich von Nebelschutz. The idea was simple: provide comfort, and they would talk freely. They did. The transcripts became invaluable intelligence. The Americans learned from this example, but improved it. They expanded the British concept of humane manipulation into a national doctrine. Camp Clinton, Camp Shelby, Camp Swift, and other officer compounds became living laboratories for moral contrast. Their daily schedules balanced discipline and dignity. Roll call, breakfast, supervised recreation, lectures, and lights out. Every meal was prepared to U.S. Army standards, not enemy rations. The POW kitchens received fresh produce, meat, and dairy supplied by the War Department's Quartermaster Corps. The reasoning was pragmatic. German prisoners were expected to work, harvesting crops, repairing infrastructure, even helping in lumber mills, and productive labor required proper nutrition. Each prisoner was entitled to 3,500 calories per day, comparable to the average U.S. soldier. In contrast, a German infantryman on the Eastern Front often received less than half that during the last years of the war. The irony was not lost on the captives. Menus were standardized but not Spartan. Breakfast might include oatmeal, eggs, and coffee. Lunch, a stew or roast. Dinner, a simple meat dish, bread, and fruit. Sundays were special. Roast beef or turkey, mashed potatoes, corn, and apple pie. The taste of small-town America itself. It was in these simple meals that the moral weight of America's approach revealed itself. German field marshals who had dined under chandeliers now ate in wooden halls, but found the food, ironically, more honest, more human. Many later wrote that it was in these mess halls that they first began to question the myth of Nazi superiority. The humane treatment extended beyond the kitchen. The Americans understood that psychological erosion was not achieved through fear, but through contrast. Captured officers who had once delivered lectures on Aryan destiny were now invited to attend English classes, film screenings, and cultural events. U.S. officials carefully selected films that showcased democratic ideals, Frank Capra dramas, westerns, even documentaries about freedom of speech. At first, some German officers refused to watch. Others came out of curiosity, then stayed for the storytelling. Over time, they began to debate, not about military tactics, but about governance, justice, and morality.